Hi, welcome to Think for Yourself. This is an introduction to critical thinking. My name is Mark Thorsby, and in this video we're following a workbook for arguments by David Morrow and Anthony Weston. Here's what the book looks like. So if you'd like to, you can follow along by getting the book in which you can complete the various exercises. So what we've been taking a look at, as you know, for those who have been following the series, is we've been articulating a variety of rules of reasoning that are helpful when both analyzing arguments by others as well as making our own arguments. Really towards the latter goal there of making our own arguments, we've been discussing, especially in the last video, the idea of making extended arguments. And if you recall, an extended argument is, let's go over here. An extended argument is an argument in which you have multiple arguments that are compiled together, in which different arguments function as support for different premises and different conclusions throughout. Extended arguments are some of the hardest arguments because they can be quite complicated in terms of the relationship between the minor arguments and the major arguments, if we could distinguish them in that way. Now, we've looked at a number of different rules of reasoning. For instance, let's sort of zoom in here. We looked at the idea of the need of exploring an issue, right, is that you shouldn't begin with a position, but you should begin by really thinking through an issue. Not only should you, in Rule 29, should you begin with an issue, but in Rule 30, we talked about the idea that you want to spend time spelling out the basic ideas of your arguments and reframing your argument accordingly. Let's see here, let's go here. We're going to take, in Rule 31, we looked at the idea that you need to defend premises with arguments of their own. So there we really focused on the idea of developing extended arguments. You'll recall we looked at, right, for instance, this is a sort of diagram of what a more complex extended argument can look like. Now, what we're going to start on today is we're going to be introduced discuss two more rules of reasoning, and then we'll conclude our section on extended arguments. Now, the first rule we're looking at here is Rule 32, consider objections. Excuse me. So this is important because we need to, whenever you build an argument, so by this point, in terms of developing your own extended argument, you've already essentially structured your ideas into an argumentative form. But one of the next things to do is, once you've figured out the basic elements of your argument, is you have to consider what the possible objections to that argument might be. Now, an objection is merely a counterpoint that someone might make against your argument. Typically, people make objections not to the conclusion of your argument, but to your premises. So it's important to recognize that if someone disagrees with your conclusion, but not with your argument, right? If your argument's logical and valid, then they're the one who they haven't made sense of what happened there? They haven't made sense of the type of objection you've made. But a lot of times, most objections are made against the premises of an argument. In other words, for instance, if I argue that you should study because you have a test tomorrow, right? Well, if you're going to attack that argument, you'd want to attack the premise, not the conclusion. Not the conclusion you should study, but the premise that there's a test tomorrow, right? For instance, you could say, yes, there's a test tomorrow, but that test is easy and you've already mastered the material, for instance, right? So when you're developing your own arguments, you really have to consider why you might actually be wrong. And this oftentimes can be difficult simply because once we build an argument, typically we're committed to it, hopefully, but this also means that we can become biased, as it were, in terms of our evaluation of our own arguments. So you really need to consider two big questions here. One which is, well, what arguments are there against my conclusions, right? What are the different types of arguments against my conclusion? But on top of that, not only what are the arguments against my conclusion or my premises, but what's the best arguments against my argument? So you not only want to consider the possible objections, but you want to weigh those objections to determine which ones are the ones most important to respond to. Many times when someone makes an argument, there are too many possible objections for someone to realistically and practically identify and respond to each and all of them. So what's really key is to respond to those objections which are the biggest and the most important. So what are some of the types of objections here? Well, I call this sort of counterexample objections. A counterexample objection is one which challenges the validity of the logical structure of your argument by saying, listen, I can create a counterexample using the same logical structure that you've given me. So if your argument has certain premises and then a conclusion, a counterexample would essentially, by analogy, demonstrate that if you accept all those premises, it does not necessarily follow that whatever conclusion you've identified is what we can infer, right? So you have counterexample objections to consider. And there really you're talking about, I think, considering the logical structure of your argument. So this sort of bleeds into the second example I give here, which is logical objections. Another example here would be false dilemma objections. And by the way, this doesn't come from the book. I just sort of threw these in here. A false dilemma objection would be the objection that says, listen, your argument, you say we have a choice, either A or B, but perhaps there's a third alternative. So a lot of, for instance, papers, when I see students write compare and contrast sorts of papers, where they'll take one philosopher's views and then contrast them with another philosopher's views. Say, for instance, you're writing a paper on Plato, you contrast it with Aristotle, right? That's fine, but a lot of times you might get trapped into creating what looks like a dilemma between either Aristotle's position or Plato's position on the other hand, and that might be a false dilemma. So someone could object to your argument that you've created a false dilemma. Think here also is that the types of objections can also be linked up with all the different types of fallacies we've looked at throughout the course, whether formal or informal. Another objection here is explanatory objections. Sometimes it's also important to consider the idea that you may have created an argument and then given an explanation or an example, an explanatory objection, I guess, in that case. You may give an example or an explanation, but someone may challenge your explanation or they may challenge your example. So it's important to consider the possible objections in that way. There's also what we might call categorical objections. These are usually the most, I don't know why my computer keeps doing that, my apologies. Another example here is what we might call a categorical objection. Now, a categorical objection would be an objection that says that you've completely misunderstood the category of the problem you're addressing or talking about. In philosophy, there's a famous argument by Gilbert Ryle that argues, for instance, that the difference between mind and body, right, or body and soul, right, these sort of classic distinctions, he argues that whenever philosophers talk about mind and body, they're trying to treat the word mind as if it belongs in the same category as that of body, as if these two things are categorically comparable. And he argues that this isn't the case. So a categorical objection would be any sort of objection that might really that might challenge the very categories with which your terms are being related. Another one, as I call researched objections. For instance, another objection could be, for instance, okay, you've made this argument, but guess what? All of the research in the secondary literature seems to suggest a different conclusion. And so if the research suggests a different conclusion, the question then becomes, well, why are you making this argument? And why is your argument not consistent or conducive to these other sorts of conclusions? So you can also have what I might call researched objections, where basically when you do the research on the position, you'll discover that the research doesn't match your conclusion or your argument. So those are some of the types of objections that might be possible. Now, how should you practice? Well, one of the things really you need to do is you need to learn to come up with objections to positions you've already taken. So this requires the ability to not only understand your position, but to really look at it from sort of a third-person perspective and then be critical of it. So this is really, really important. And because the thing is, you want to think of these objections, of course, and then address them in your papers and in your writing. But importantly, you want to here, one moment. My apologies there. We had someone who was calling, right? So you want to practice coming up with objections to positions you have. And this requires learning to be critical of your own arguments, which is a very, very good thing to become accustomed to. So how should you do that? Well, when you get stuck, you should start asking questions. Your biggest tool here is the ability to ask questions and to critically evaluate. So you can ask lots of different types of questions, but for instance, you should, for instance, look at the assumptions your argument makes. Are there objections to those assumptions? Look at whether or not you've created any sort of disjunctive statement, an either or, and look and ask questions about whether or not there might be a third possibility. Sorry, I'm getting emails. Frustrating. So you want to get into the habit of asking questions. Really, I think one of the big typical mistakes we see here when it comes to crafting your own extended arguments is a lot of times people will only take the pro side of an argument, only consider the things which support their ideas rather than the things which negate their ideas. And it's really, really important that if you're going to have a good argument, you do so. So I've created sort of a little flow chart here, which I think sort of exemplifies what we're talking about. When you're developing an argument, of course, you're going to begin with research here and thinking about whatever the issue or problem is. And then after looking at research and looking at alternatives, you're going to formulate your own argument. And we've talked already about exploring issues and formulating your arguments with compiling multiple arguments together. So we sort of looked at these things. But once you've formulated this argument, you need to consider the possible objections that might arise. And importantly, what the best objections of those are. Typically, you'll formulate a defense to those best objections, but sometimes you'll want to be more exhaustive. But once you figure out what the objections are, you can see you have a choice. You either have to formulate a defense or a counter argument to the objection, or you need to reevaluate your own argument and really begin the process again. Sometimes we will discover that the arguments we create are not good, being that other people's objections are too large or too substantial to really overcome without really reevaluating or reformulating the whole argument itself from the beginning. So you have to be open to that possibility, because if you're not open to that possibility, what ends up happening is your objections seem to look like straw man objections, where the objections you may discuss, you'll be overly hasty in your explanation of them, which would allow you to sort of kind of pass them off as not being substantial enough. So you want to really avoid that, because if you make those sorts of arguments, usually people will recognize them, and more importantly, you'll ultimately come to the realization that they're problematic. So, okay. Rule 33, and let's move to the last rule here, which is, okay, once you've looked at the objections, now you have to consider different alternatives, right? So think of it this way. When you craft an argument, well, that's another way of saying that you've addressed an idea of some sort. And if you've addressed an idea, that's something like you've tried to solve some sort of conceptual problem. Now, it depends on what kind of thing you're writing. If you're writing in philosophy, of course, you're trying to solve some sort of philosophical problem or conundrum. But most people who are writing arguments and who need to use these same critical thinking skills probably are not writing in philosophy proper. And so that means that the nature of the problem that you may be looking at may come in different ways. For instance, if you're writing an English paper, if you're a student, then your problem may be more exegetical or interpretive, right, rather than paradoxical or contradictory problem that a philosopher might look at, right? But regardless of how you define the problem, you can see that however you understand the problem is going to be the way in which you understand or explore alternative approaches to solving that problem, right? And here we're talking about looking at alternative approaches to the problem that your thesis addresses, but you want to look at all different types of alternatives. You can see in many ways the question of Rule 32, where we talk about considering objections, is related to alternatives, because you may want to come up with alternative approaches because of potential objections. And you'll get a sense of this here, for instance. Let's go right here. So for instance, and this comes from the textbook, page 179. Imagine, for instance, someone makes this quick little statement. They say, Durham swimming pools are overcrowded, especially on the weekends. Therefore, Durham needs to build more pools. Okay, so here you have a clear conclusion, which is to build more pools, and a clear premise, the notion that there's overcrowding, especially on the weekends. Now you can see here there's some couple objections might arise. For instance, overcrowded looks vague. What exactly does overcrowding mean? Clearly overcrowding is a problem, but there may be different ways of addressing the problem. So for instance, not only do we recognize there's vagueness here, but there are potentially other ways to address the problem. For instance, perhaps we don't know enough information about how Durham swimming pools are operated. For instance, maybe Durham could raise their prices. By raising the prices, you'll probably lower the crowding. So that may be a way to solve the problem that might be a lot cheaper, in fact, might be more advantageous economically than just building more pools. Right. Another problem here is that another objection to this is that it might not be possible for Durham to build more pools. Now, one of the other questions is you have to also ask, well, why is one proposal better than another? For instance, why would it be better to build more swimming pools, or why would it be better, for instance, just to raise the price of admission, thereby reducing the overcrowding? Now, that means you have to look for serious alternatives here. So when we're addressing an issue, we don't want to just think about, there's lots of possible alternatives. For instance, someone could say, Durham swimming pools are overcrowded, especially on weekends. Therefore, we should close the swimming pool. By closing the swimming pool, we'll address the overcrowding. Clearly, that is not a serious alternative because it would defeat the very purpose of the business, right? So sometimes you have to also be creative and look for different sorts of alternatives that you may have just never really thought of. For instance, Durham swimming pools are overcrowded, especially on weekends. So maybe one of the things be more creative is, right, let's go back to my sort of alternative. Well, maybe you should just raise the price. Well, some people may say, yeah, but if you raise the price, then what happens is that then people aren't, it'll diminish the need of the community for a public swimming pool, right? And so that doesn't seem fair. So maybe you could be creative. You could say, okay, well, you could say that on every other weekend, we're going to raise the price, but every other weekend, we're going to reduce the price. So we'll have a sort of staggered price, and maybe that could address some of those concerns. So I don't know if that's a very good example, but you can see here, by being creative, a lot of times we can address a problem in really different ways, sometimes which are better than the other proposals. Now, the other possibility is you may actually need to change your argument. Think here that the real goal is truth, not just persuasion. So the goal of an extended argument really shouldn't be just to have the best argument in that particular case, right? Just to win the argument, but ultimately to actually come up with a real proposal that makes sense and can actually address the problem. So the goal should be truth, not just simply persuading other people. Of course, arguments are necessary in order to persuade people, so we're not denying that. But I think that's an important element, is that sometimes you have to come to the conclusion, the hard conclusion, that your argument should be changed, and instead perhaps you should endorse one of the other alternatives. And remember, there are always different alternatives. There's never just one solution. Always think about it this way, there's always tension. A good argument always has tension. And so for instance, when you're considering alternatives, you're considering the tension between different sorts of conclusions that might be made to address a specific problem. So that's pretty important stuff. So how can you practice this? Well, for instance, one of the things you can do is whenever you see a proposal for something, get into the practice of identifying two alternatives for that proposal, and then see if you can state which one you think is best and why, and sort of come up with a supporting argument for the alternative. So I've just come up with a sort of quick example here. This doesn't come from the book, but it's similar to the examples that are given in the practice exercise set. For instance, imagine if someone makes the argument, quote, in an effort to equitably compensate student amateur football players, the prohibition against paying student athletes directly should be overturned, and we should begin paying student athletes a share of the money they generate for their universities. Right? And here, for instance, when I'm thinking about, for instance, mainly football players at large institutions, that make, like, think for instance LSU or something like this, where the student athletes are not paid directly, but they are in effect generating millions of dollars for their universities. People have argued that they need to be compensated. So, okay, this argument gives you one type of proposal. Well, what are two potential alternatives for the proposal? For instance, the proposal that I was giving here was the idea that we should just directly pay student athletes a share of the money they generate for their universities. Well, okay, this creates some of the problems here because obviously if we start paying student athletes, they're no longer amateur athletes. They essentially become, by default, professional athletes because now we're paying them professionally. So maybe another alternative could be to say that that students should be given a share of compensation in proportion to certain sorts of scholarship benefits. So, for instance, maybe one proposal is instead to give students a more comparable scholarship for what they're doing. Another proposal, for instance, might be just to say that we should put a cap on the amount of money that universities can generate from their student athletic programs. Right. So there's sort of two different possibilities. Just give bigger scholarship money, or for instance, maybe what we should do is just get rid of the idea of making lots of money and just reduce it. Now, which one of those two is better? I don't know. I would probably argue that the latter is probably the better. I don't know if I'm right or wrong. I haven't really thought too hard about this problem. But for instance, I might argue that it's better just to reduce it because not every university is the same. Many universities have athletic programs that are not, by any means, million-dollar money makers for those universities. So by creating a cap on the universities that do have large athletic programs that make lots of money, what we can do is we can make it more commensurate. Or, for instance, maybe another alternative would be we take a share of the money made at larger universities and then somehow put it back into funding for other underrepresented programs. So there's different sorts of possibilities. So what you want to do here is get into the practice of identifying different proposals and then stating which one is better and why. Okay, that concludes our discussion for today, which is considering alternatives and objections for extended arguments. Thank you very much for watching online. I apologize, there's a couple little hiccups in the recording of this video, but I appreciate your time and your attention. Thank you very much, and I'll see you guys online.